My name's Jessica Hope. I'm owner and managing director of Wimbart. We're a boutique PR agency that specialises in African tech.
And why would a startup want to get publicity? It's a kind of obvious question, but can you just lay out the ground of why you'd go looking for publicity?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why. I mean, the first one is often just revenue. If, for example, you have a company that sort of needs to sell something, you just need eyeballs on your product in order to sell it, so you need some visibility. For a lot of people, it might be also for investment. So if you're a really small startup and you're looking to seed investment, you know, if you manage to get an article in some of the leading tech blogs on the continent, say for example Tech Cabal or Techloy or one of those guys, that investors keep an eye on and they read about you from a number of ways, they might sort of then be interested in potentially investing in you at some stage. I think for a lot of people as well, it might also just help for a little bit of ego in terms of helping them. I think validation as well. You know, if you're doing an 80 or 90 hour week as a startup, you know, you need to sort of maybe put something out there so other people can sort of feel your pain or read about you or understand what you're up to and what you're trying to achieve.
But importantly, you need to spend money on communications.
I think so, but you have to spend the right money at the right time as well. So I think for some companies, you know, they might think about PR a little bit too soon. You do need to make sure that operationally your company is sound first, I think, before you engage with with a PR practitioner. By all means, have it on your radar and think about your story, think about your narrative, think about your messaging, but you might not always need PR from day one, because you have to think, for example, if you manage to get loads of fantastic press and you had a rush of traffic to your website, would you then be able to fulfill any new business, any potential sales? So you need to make sure that you've got the right balance.
You talked about story there. What is a story?
Difficult one. I'm going to start by saying that just because you exist, that does not a story make. So you have to make sure that you know what your story is relevant, and you have to make sure that you have a narrative and messaging. So say, for example, you have a product. Why is it different to anyone else's product already on the market? How is it better? Or if you're building a company, you know, what challenges are you improving on? What are you addressing? Those sort of areas, really.
It's not enough just to be an African startup.
No, I don't think so, because there's lots of African startups across the continent. You know, I deal mostly with West Africa and Nigeria especially. There's lots of e-commerce startups, lots and lots of e-commerce startups. But, you know, are you a Conga? Are you a Jumia, for example? You know, those guys have raised hundreds of millions of dollars between them. So that's why international press will often be quite interested in them and the operations and the challenges. But if you're much, much smaller than those, a journalist, especially in the West, might not find it as interesting. So you need to make sure you have a certain unique element to make it more newsworthy. And
in that thing of international press, why would it become important to you as a startup to need the international press? Because people like the idea of it, but it's particularly important, isn't it, at a certain scale of investment?
I think it is in terms of scale of investment. So at seed stage, it might not be so important. However, for example, if you're looking for a larger scale investment, if you manage to get into Mashable or TechCrunch or Wall Street Journal or New York Times, and the really big investors and the venture capitalists are reading those, then that's really going to help your cause. I think especially as international investors, the first time they hear about you, they're going to Google you. So if, for example, you have great coverage and a spectrum of outlets, it helps build your story and make you more of a compelling investment. You know, the classic example is with Iroko and Jason Njoku. He was fortunate enough to be featured in TechCrunch, I think 2010. He did an interview with Sarah Lacey, and the venture capitalist Tiger Global contacted him after reading that article, and I think maybe 6 months later he closed on $3 million investment. But that's a unicorn story for West Africa that just doesn't happen very often. But that's kind of the process, really, of
the principle remains the same.
The principle remains the same. Numbers were smaller, but I mean, you know, $3 million for a Nigerian startup 5 years ago was an awful lot of money.
And what are the mistakes that people make?
There's a few. I think people might, again, as I mentioned, rush into PR too quickly before they've really got their story straight. You know, don't forget, when you have a startup, your company often pivots really early on. So you might do a great press launch and get lots of coverage, but then your company might change and you might have to pivot several times and people just get confused.
Yes.
I think also a lot of starter founders spend a lot of time, often they might rant or they might have a personal blog which sort of damages their reputation, and they might spend more time actually building a reputation as a spokesperson rather than focusing their attention on public relations and building their business. And I think, do you want to be famous, or do you want to build a company that's going to be famous? So I think you need to think about how you position yourself. And I think also a lot of the time you need validation from people outside of your circle, and it's what we talked about in terms of having a story, having a narrative. Of course, your friends and family are always going to be enthusiastic, and they're going to think it's great, and they're going to support you, but they might not know what a story is. They might not know how to build a narrative, and they might not be able to help you navigate, the tricky world of press and how you pitch to journalists and how you take your story to journalists as well. So I think that that's another mistake that a lot of people make. They're not quite sure on how to make their business into a story that's interesting and digestible for journalists.
And you've used the word narrative several times. How do you understand that?
I think it's a story as in like why you come into existence and why you're important.
It's a way of explaining.
I think so. I mean, without being too brutal, the first question any PR should be asking a new client is, so what?
Yeah.
Because that's what a journalist is going to ask the PR person. And the PR person is the intermediary, really. We're the person who helps the client filter the story and helps make a story newsworthy to journalists as well. So often it will be context. So if, for example, you're building a company and you've sold, you've cornered 50% of a market, it might be a very niche market, but that's a great story. So a PR person can help build the narrative with context, with numbers, with additional information, with socio-economic information, all of those things that will then help transpire into something, a blog or a newspaper or TV, broadcast or radio or something like that.
And what's the relationship between substance and a story? Because it quite often seems to me that I cover a lot of startup stories and there's not much there. So how can you help clients understand the need for actually there to be something to back it up? I
think it's actually being almost quite interrogating your client in terms of, again, going back to so what, who cares? And then once you start having a conversation, unpicking the story, then that helps to sort of figure out the substance. Sometimes I've worked with people who've had really fantastic stories, but they haven't figured out actually what the great story or angle is, what the substance is. So I worked with a client a couple of years back, and there was a particularly timely period of news to do with health in West Africa. And they had a fantastic product, and they had almost 1 million views on their website in 1 week. But when I saw the press release, it had no mention of that at all. And that's what we're talking about in terms of substance. The fact that it's newsworthy, that the news cycle in the West and in Africa is already covering the subject area. These people were experts in what they were doing, and they built a website that had 1 million hits in a week. Africa, the West, wherever, that's a great news story. So that's the substance, really. And after I worked with them, their product was featured in quite a lot of high-profile outlets as well. So that's what the PR person does, really. It helps you curate a story and figure out what the substance is. And I'm sorry to say, sometimes we have to say when there probably isn't any substance.
And lastly, what about timing? Because we talked about timing earlier. What's so important about timing?
I think you have to understand the sort of news cycle, in terms of when you send out a press release, but timing in terms of thinking about press when you're setting up your company. Press actually does take quite a lot of time sometimes, so you need to make sure that you have to have that you do have time to be able to speak to your press person, brief them, give them information about the company, because the press person needs to really understand the nuts and bolts of your company. But I think also, if you're doing an 80 or 90 hour week just to get your company off the ground, do you have time to spend a couple of hours a week with a press person? Are you able to get off a flight and then speak to The Economist, speak to the New York Times, speak to the Wall Street Journal? Are you able to do that? Are you willing to do that? And I think, press doesn't just cost in terms of money, but in terms of time as well and resource. Are you able to do a photo shoot? Are you able to go and organise something or do an event or attend certain events? So those are the things that I think startups really have to consider. Do you have the time to invest in your public relations strategy?